3 days ago, Parker Schnabel made a discovery in the Klondike that brought his whole mining operation to a sudden halt. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a mechanical breakdown. It was something so deeply personal and utterly unexpected that the hardest working young miner in the Yukon completely broke down in front of the cameras for the first time in all 15 seasons. The Frozen Time Capsule, November 23, 2024. The temperature at Dominion Creek had plunged to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, so bitterly cold that the crew had to keep all the equipment running non-stop just to stop the diesel from gelling and the hydraulic lines from freezing solid. Parker Schnabel stood at the edge of his cut, watching his excavator operator dig through permafrost that hadn't felt sunlight in thousands of years. They were going deeper on this claim than Parker had ever dared before, chasing a pay streak that ground-penetrating radar showed could be the richest stretch of Dominion Creek he'd seen in 5 years of mining there. The crew was worn out. They'd been grinding through 16-hour shifts, desperate to hit bedrock before winter shut everything down for good. Brennan Ruoff, Parker's foreman, had been pushing hard for them to stop while they were still ahead. He argued that the danger of equipment failure in those extreme temperatures wasn't worth risking just a few more days. But Parker had that gut feeling, the same instinct his grandfather John had always tried to teach him, the quiet certainty that something big was waiting just below, if he had the nerve to keep going. The excavator bucket punched through a layer of ice-cemented gravel and came up with the usual haul rocks, frozen muck, and ancient organic material packed into dark sediment. But as the operator swung the bucket toward the sluice box, something glinted in the light. Something metallic, sharp-edged, and clearly man-made among all the rounded stones and dirt. Parker spotted it instantly and yelled for the operator to stop. His breath billowed in thick clouds in the freezing air as he ran over. Nestled in the frozen gravel was a metal box, about 12 inches square and 8 inches deep. It was coated in rust and sediment, but amazingly well preserved. The permafrost had acted like a natural deep freeze, protecting it perfectly from the decay that would have destroyed anything left on the surface. Parker reached in carefully, his gloved hands closing around the box. He felt its weight, its solid feel that suggested something was still inside after decades buried underground. He carried it to the heated workshop, and the crew gathered around, curiosity taking over as routine mining suddenly turned into an archaeological find. Uncovering artifacts in Klondike permafrost wasn't rare. Miners often found mammoth tusks, old tools, and relics from the 1890s gold rush. But something about this box felt different to Parker. It felt strangely personal in a way he couldn't put into words yet. In the warmth of the workshop, Parker gently cleaned the surface, brushing off dirt and ice crystals, revealing details that made his pulse race. The metal was steel, hand-welded at the corners with the kind of careful, sturdy work that spoke of something built to last. And scratched into the lid with a sharp tool were initials and a date. J.S. 1946. Parker's hands began to tremble. J.S. John Schnabel, his grandfather. But that didn't add up. Parker knew his grandfather's history. He knew John hadn't come to Alaska until the 1970s, decades after 1946. The family stories were clear. John had been a successful businessman in Oregon, only getting into mining later in life. He'd eventually brought his family north and turned Big Nugget Mine into a legendary operation. There was no 1946 chapter in that story. No young John Schnabel working the Yukon decades before the life Parker had always known. But the initials were unmistakable, formed in the exact distinctive style Parker had seen in his grandfather's handwriting on countless documents and notes over the years. And the box itself was exactly the kind of practical, tough container John would have built, simple, solid, designed to protect something precious in brutal conditions. Parker carefully worked the corroded but still functional latch and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture out for 78 years, were papers, dozens of letters written in his grandfather's handwriting. Photographs that were still sharp despite their age. A small leather journal filled with entries from April through November 1946. And underneath it all, a pocket watch engraved with initials that weren't John's EMR. Parker carefully lifted out one of the letters. The paper was brittle despite its protection. He started reading. The first line hit him like a punch. Dear Eleanor, I know you'll never read this, but I'm writing anyway because I don't know any other way to survive what happened. I came to the Yukon to forget you, to disappear into the kind of hard country that doesn't leave room for grief. But the silence up here only makes your absence louder. Parker looked up at his crew, who were watching him with growing worry. The toughest young miner in the Yukon, the man who'd taken his grandfather's legacy and built it into something even bigger than John had dreamed, was sitting there holding letters from a version of his grandfather he never knew existed. A young man, heartbroken, hiding in the Klondike from some devastating tragedy in 1946. And Parker suddenly realized that everything he thought he understood about his origins, about the man who raised him and taught him how to mine, was incomplete. John Schnabel's secret journey. Parker sent his crew back to work and spent the rest of the day alone in the workshop, reading through the letters and journal entries, slowly piecing together a story that explained so much about his grandfather, while at the same time turning John Schnabel into a stranger. The story that came together was heartbreakingly simple. John Schnabel had been engaged to be married in 1945 to a woman named Eleanor Marie Richardson, the EMR whose initials were engraved on the pocket watch. The early letters were filled with the passionate, hopeful idealism of a young man who believed his whole future lay ahead like an open highway. John wrote about plans to start a business, the house he wanted to buy for Eleanor, the family they would raise, and the life they would build together in post-war America. He had served in the Pacific during World War II, survived campaigns that claimed thousands of lives, and returned home convinced that making it through the war meant he had earned a peaceful, prosperous future. But in the spring of 1946, something happened that shattered those dreams completely. The journal entries from April were broken, almost incoherent, circling again and again around one crushing fact: Eleanor had died. The details were few, John's grief was too raw for long explanations. But Parker pieced together that she had been ill, that it had come on suddenly, and that John had been completely powerless to stop it. One entry, dated April 19th, was brutally short: buried her today. I don't know how to exist in a world where she doesn't. The following entries chronicled John's decision to leave Oregon, to flee as far as possible from the life he had planned and the memories that haunted every familiar street and corner. He'd heard stories from other veterans about the Yukon, a remote, unforgiving frontier, so demanding that it left no room for grief, a place where a man could work himself to exhaustion and perhaps find a reason to keep going. In May 1946, John loaded basic supplies into a truck and drove north, crossing into Canada and eventually reaching Dawson City. Parker found himself crying as he read, tears he hadn't shed since his grandfather's death in 2016. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of loss that had formed his grandfather's character. The John Parker had known was tough, demanding, impossible to please, always pushing Parker to work harder, dig deeper, and never settle for good enough. Parker had sometimes resented that hardness, had wondered why John couldn't offer approval more freely. But reading these letters from a shattered 24-year-old man, Parker finally understood. His grandfather had rebuilt himself from total devastation. He had learned to shield his heart by never opening it fully again. The 1946 journal chronicled John's first months in the Yukon, working placer claims for other miners, learning the brutal physical labor of moving gravel and running sluices that turned dirt into concrete. He wrote about grizzly bears, mosquitoes, and an isolation so complete that days could pass without another human voice. But slowly, entry by entry, the journal showed John beginning to heal. He never forgot Eleanor, he wrote about her constantly, but he began learning how to carry the grief instead of letting it crush him. He wrote about finding satisfaction in hard work, about the honest simplicity of mining, where effort turned directly into gold, where a man's worth was measured by what he could pull from the ground, rather than social status or connections. By August, John was writing about feeling alive again, about rediscovering purpose even in the middle of heartbreak. In September, he wrote about meeting other miners, forming friendships forged in shared hardship, and starting to imagine a future that might hold more than just survival. And in late October, he wrote an entry that Parker read 3 times, trying to absorb its full weight. I've decided to leave the Yukon, not because I couldn't make it here, but because I think I finally can. This place saved me, it gave me the space to grieve and rebuild. But I don't belong to the wilderness, I belong to the world, and I think I'm finally strong enough to rejoin it. I'm taking Eleanor's watch and these letters, burying them at the claim I've been working. Someday, maybe decades from now, another miner will find them, and they'll know that someone came here broken and left whole. Parker sat with that entry for a long time, realizing that the box he had found wasn't lost or accidentally buried. John had placed it there on purpose, a time capsule marking his transformation, physical proof of the journey from utter devastation to healing. And 78 years later, John's grandson had discovered it while mining the same ground, creating a connection across nearly 8 decades that felt almost mystical in its timing. But there was still one piece Parker hadn't fully processed. If John left the Yukon in 1946, what happened in the decades before he returned in the 1970s? Who did he become during those intervening years? And most importantly, where did Parker's actual grandmother fit into a story that seemed to end with Eleanor, the woman in the photographs? Among the letters and journal entries, Parker found a small collection of photographs documenting John's 1946 journey. There were images of a much younger grandfather than Parker had ever seen, a 24-year-old man who looked both ancient and boyish, aged prematurely by grief and war, yet still carrying the vulnerability of youth. John standing at various mining claims, beside sluice boxes with mountains rising behind him. John with other miners, all of them filthy exhausted, and grinning with the camaraderie that comes from shared hardship. But the photographs that stopped Parker cold were the ones of Eleanor. There were 5 of them, carefully preserved in the oilcloth wrapping, showing a beautiful young woman with dark hair and an open smile that still radiated warmth after 78 years. In one photo, she and John stood together, his arm around her shoulders, both looking at the camera with the confident happiness of people who believed their future was secure. On the back, in John's handwriting, Oregon, December 1944, 2 months before I shipped out, promised her I'd come back and marry her. Kept the first promise, never got to keep the second. Parker stared at that photograph for a long time. This woman, who had been completely erased from family history, whose very existence Parker had never suspected, should have been his grandmother. Their children should have been his parents. The entire Schnabel family line that led to Parker shouldn't even exist. It was only possible because Eleanor had died, forcing John to eventually build a different life. It was a disturbing thought that Parker's own existence depended on tragedy, that Eleanor's death had been the prerequisite for his birth. And it made him think about his actual grandmother, the woman John eventually married after returning from the Yukon. Parker had known her, loved her, watched her and John together for years. They had seemed solid, comfortable, genuinely affectionate. But had John ever told her about Eleanor? Had she known she was second choice, the woman John turned to after his first love was taken from him? Parker needed answers. The box couldn't give him. He needed to understand the full story to know what happened in the decades between John burying these letters in 1946 and John bringing his family to Alaska in the 1970s. The journal and letters ended with John's decision to leave the Yukon. The next chapter existed only in records and memories Parker would have to dig up just as carefully as he dug for gold. He started by calling his mother, a conversation that was painful, emotional, and ultimately eye-opening. Yes, she confirmed John had been married before. Very briefly, in the late 1940s, to a woman he'd known before the war. The marriage had lasted less than a year, and ended in annulment. No, she didn't know the details. John never talked about it. Then, in the early 1950s, John had met Nancy, Parker's grandmother, and they had built the life Parker had always known about. But here was the crucial detail Parker's mother shared. Nancy had known about Eleanor. John had told her early in their relationship. He had been honest about the grief he carried, about the time he'd spent in the Yukon trying to heal. Nancy had accepted that history with grace, understanding that she wasn't competing with Eleanor's memory. She was inheriting a man who had been shaped by loss and had learned to love again despite it. Parker took this in, feeling the whole narrative shift once more. This wasn't a story about John hiding his past or betraying Eleanor's memory by eventually finding happiness with someone else. This was a story about surviving unbearable loss, about healing enough to risk loving again, about building a life that honored grief without being trapped by it. But Parker still felt compelled to visit the places this young version of his grandfather had lived. The journal mentioned specific locations, claims John had worked, a cabin where he'd spent the winter of 1946. Some of those places probably no longer existed, but Parker was a miner and a student of Klondike mining history. If John's cabin was still standing, Parker could find it. Following the trail, Parker suspended mining operations, a decision that stunned his crew and would have stunned his grandfather under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Parker had found something far more valuable than gold: context for understanding the man who had shaped his entire life. He was going to follow that trail wherever it led, even if it meant losing precious mining time in the narrow window before winter shut everything down. The journal mentioned that John had worked a claim on Hunker Creek, a tributary of the Klondike River about 15 miles southeast of Dawson City. In 1946, Hunker Creek had been actively mined, with dozens of operations pulling gold from its gravels. By 2024, most of those claims were abandoned or consolidated into larger operations, but Parker knew the area well. He'd explored Hunker Creek while researching potential claims, and knew its history and geography. Parker loaded his truck with supplies and drove out alone, following rough mining roads that gradually deteriorated into trails as he moved farther from the main operations. The journal gave specific landmarks: a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the creek where the water ran especially clear, a stand of spruce trees that had somehow survived the mining that had stripped vegetation from most of the area. Parker navigated by those descriptions, combining John's 78-year-old observations with his own knowledge of the terrain. 3 hours of searching brought him to a section of Hunker Creek that matched the journal's details. The distinctive rocks were still there, aged and weathered but unmistakable. The creek still bent in the same way, though its course had shifted slightly over the decades. And in the spruce stand, partially collapsed but still standing, was a small cabin. Parker approached carefully, knowing that old structures in the Yukon could be unstable and dangerous. But the cabin's core logs were solid, and the roof, though sagging, had kept the interior relatively dry. The door hung on one hinge but opened when Parker pushed gently. Inside was a small space, maybe 12 by 14 feet, a small wood stove, a rough wooden bunk, shelves made from planks, and a table with one chair. Everything was covered in decades of dust and debris, but the basics were still recognizable. This was where John Schnabel had lived through the winter of 1946, alone with his grief and his determination to survive it. Parker stood in the center of the cabin, trying to imagine his grandfather at 24, warming cans of food on that stove, sleeping on that bunk, sitting at that table writing the letters Parker had found. The isolation must have been crushing during the winter darkness, when the Yukon gets only a few hours of twilight at midday, and temperatures drop to 40 or 50 below zero. But John had survived it. More than survived, he had used it to transform himself. On the shelf, Parker found something that made his breath catch, a tin cup, rusted but intact, with initials scratched into its side. G.S., his grandfather's cup, left behind when John departed in late 1946. Parker picked it up carefully, this small artifact that physically connected him to his grandfather's hidden history, and felt tears coming again. He spent the rest of the day in and around the cabin, photographing everything, collecting the few remaining artifacts, trying to absorb the emotional weight of the place. At one point he found himself sitting where John must have sat, looking out the small window at Hunker Creek flowing past, at the mountains rising beyond. And he understood something profound about the man who had raised him. John Schnabel had learned something in this cabin, in this brutal landscape, that shaped everything about how he approached life, family, and mining. He'd learned that survival demanded absolute commitment, that comfort had to be earned through relentless work, that weakness could kill you. Those weren't abstract lessons for John, they were survival tools forged in grief and isolation. And when John later became a grandfather, he tried to pass those tools on to Parker, sometimes harshly, always demanding, because John genuinely believed that toughness and determination were the only things that could protect his grandson from the kind of breaking John himself had endured. Parker had sometimes thought his grandfather didn't believe in him, that John's constant pushing meant disappointment in who Parker was. But sitting in this cabin, holding his grandfather's tin cup, Parker finally understood the pushing came from the opposite place. John had believed in Parker completely, he had seen potential that terrified him, because he knew how easily potential could be destroyed by softness, tragedy, or lack of preparation. Every harsh word, every impossible standard, every time John had told Parker to work harder, had been John's way of trying to save his grandson from the kind of breaking John himself had experienced. The choice John made Parker return to Dominion Creek as darkness fell, the November night coming early this far north. His crew was waiting, worried about their boss who had disappeared for a full day without explanation. Brennan approached him carefully, asking if everything was okay, if Parker wanted to talk about whatever was going on. Parker shook his head, not ready yet to share what he'd discovered, and retreated to his cabin. That night, he finished reading the journal, the final entries from late October and early November 1946. John wrote about his decision to leave the Yukon, about feeling ready to rejoin the world he'd fled 7 months earlier. But the final entry, dated November 2nd, revealed something Parker hadn't expected. Today I made a choice. I could stay here, could keep mining, could build a life in this wilderness that's given me so much. Part of me wants that. Part of me feels safer in this isolation than I ever will back in civilization. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding from grief. I'm carrying Eleanor with me, always will. But I'm also ready to live again, and I can't do that if I stay here. So I'm leaving, taking nothing but my pack and Eleanor's watch, burying everything else, the letters, the photos, and this journal, because I need to let it be history instead of carrying it every day. The Yukon healed me, now I need to trust that healing and go build whatever life comes next. Parker closed the journal and sat in silence, processing the courage that entry represented. John had been offered an escape, a place where grief and isolation were acceptable, where a man could exist without ever confronting the messy complexity of emotional life. And John had chosen to leave that safety, to deliberately make himself vulnerable again by returning to a world where love and loss were both possible. That choice echoed through decades. If John had stayed in the Yukon in 1946, there would have been no Nancy, no children, no Parker. John's willingness to risk his heart again, to trust that he could love someone new without betraying Eleanor's memory, created the family line that led to Parker standing in this cabin 78 years later. Parker thought about his own life, about the relationships he'd avoided or sabotaged, about the emotional walls he'd built that echoed his grandfather's toughness. He'd always assumed his difficulty with intimacy was just part of his personality, just the way he was wired. But maybe it was learned behavior, passed down from a grandfather who had been devastated by love and had protected himself by never being fully vulnerable again, even with the family he cherished. The next morning, Parker called his mother again and asked about Nancy, about what she had been like, what kind of relationship she and John had built. His mother's voice grew warm as she shared memories of a marriage that was solid if not wildly passionate, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of comfortable affection that deepens over decades. Your grandfather loved her, Parker's mother said firmly. Not the same way he probably loved his first fiancée, that young idealistic, everything or nothing love, but deeply genuinely. He chose to build a life with her every single day. And I think that kind of choosing, that commitment even after you know how badly love can hurt, is actually more powerful than the easy love of youth. Parker felt something shift in his understanding. John hadn't settled for Nancy, he hadn't betrayed Eleanor's memory by eventually finding happiness with someone else. He'd made the harder choice to love again, despite knowing intimately what loss felt like. To build a family despite understanding how fragile happiness could be. To risk his heart over and over because the alternative was the isolation he'd fled from in the Yukon. And when John eventually did return to the Yukon in the 1970s, it wasn't as a broken young man hiding from grief. It was as a grandfather introducing his teenage grandson to mining, sharing a landscape that had saved him decades earlier, passing on lessons about resilience and determination that John had learned in the hardest possible way. Parker realized that every moment he'd spent with his grandfather, every harsh criticism, every impossible standard, every rare word of praise, had been shaped by John's 1946 journey. His grandfather's toughness wasn't cruelty or disappointment. It was love, expressed by someone who had been shattered and rebuilt, and desperately wanted to prevent that breaking in the people he cared about. Legacy redefined music. The mining season ended 3 days after Parker returned from Hunker Creek. The weather turned brutal, bringing the kind of cold that makes equipment shatter and expose skin freeze in minutes. Parker and his crew shut down operations, secured the site for winter, and prepared to leave Dominion Creek until spring allowed them to return. But before he left, Parker did something he'd never done before. He called a crew meeting and told them everything about finding the box, about his grandfather's secret history, about the cabin, the letters, and the young man who had come to the Yukon broken and left whole. His crew listened in silence, seeing their hard-driving boss vulnerable in ways they'd never witnessed, understanding that what they'd found in the permafrost was more valuable than any gold deposit. Brennan asked the question everyone was thinking, what are you going to do with all this? The letters, the photos, the story. Parker had been wrestling with that question for days. Part of him wanted to keep it private, to protect his grandfather's memory and the family's privacy. But another part understood that the story had value beyond his personal grief and revelation. I'm going to share it, Parker said finally, not everything, not the most intimate details, but the core story about loss and healing, and the courage it takes to love again after you've been destroyed. Because I think that's a story people need to hear. I think my grandfather would want it told even if he spent his whole life not telling it himself. The decision to include the discovery in Gold Rush was harder. The show had followed Parker for 15 seasons, documenting his journey from a kid working for his grandfather to one of the most successful young miners in the Yukon. But the show focused on mining, on gold production, equipment and crew dynamics. This discovery was deeply personal, potentially too intimate for television. Parker discussed it with the producers and eventually agreed to a special segment, one that would handle the story with the respect it deserved. Not sensationalizing the grief or exploiting his grandfather's pain, but honestly exploring how discovering this hidden history had changed Parker's understanding of himself and his family. When the segment aired in December 2024, the response was overwhelming. Viewers who had watched Parker for years, who had seen him as tough and sometimes emotionally distant, reached out to share their own stories of inherited grief, of learning hard truths about family members they thought they knew completely, of discovering that the people who shaped them were far more complicated and human than they'd understood. Parker received hundreds of messages from people who had lost loved ones, who struggled with how to love again after devastation, who felt encouraged by John Schnabel's story of survival and eventual flourishing. The discovery that had begun as purely personal became something larger, a reminder that everyone carries hidden histories, that strength often comes from surviving unbearable pain, and that the courage to be vulnerable after you've been broken is the most powerful kind of bravery. For Parker himself, the discovery fundamentally changed how he approached both mining and life. He still worked with the intensity and determination his grandfather had instilled in him, but now with a deeper understanding of where that drive came from. He still pushed himself and his crew, but with more awareness of the difference between productive challenge and destructive harshness, and in his personal life, he started lowering the walls he'd built. He began allowing himself to be vulnerable in ways that terrified him, but also felt necessary. His grandfather had taught him to be tough, but the letters from 1946 taught him something John never explicitly said: that real strength includes the courage to risk your heart, even when you know exactly how badly it can be broken. Parker kept the metal box, the letters, the photographs, and the tin cup from Hunker Creek. They sit on a shelf in his cabin, physical reminders of the grandfather he thought he knew, and the young man he'd never met, connected across 78 years by permafrost that preserved what should have been lost. And every time Parker looks at them, he remembers that he is the product of tragedy and survival, of loss and healing, of a young man who came to the Yukon, broken and left whole enough to eventually create the family that led to Parker himself. The gold will run out eventually at Dominion Creek. That's the nature of mining, finding what's there and extracting it until it's gone. But the legacy Parker discovered in the permafrost, the story of resilience and redemption that explained so much about who he was and where he came from, that was something that would never be exhausted. That was the real treasure his grandfather left behind. Not in the gold Parker learned to mine, but in the example of a man who survived the unsurvivable and chose to love again. What Parker Schnabel found beneath the permafrost wasn't gold. It was his grandfather's heart, preserved for 78 years, waiting to be discovered by the grandson who needed to understand where his own toughness came from. The letters from 1946 revealed that strength isn't the absence of breaking, it's what you build after you've been shattered. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can mine is the truth about the people who shaped you.